A very, very good evening. A warm welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine, presented by Pick and Pay, and happy Chardonnay Day. It is a day for dancing in the streets and skipping down the aisles and slugging back Chablis out the bottle, except it shouldn't be Chablis, it should be Chardonnay, because we're celebrating how South Africa has taken a grape with a slightly controversial but very cool backstory and turned it into one of the cornerstones of the South African wine industry. And so we celebrate today. And I've been genuinely excited about this all day. I've had a particularly cool day. We had some fun filming with Pick and Pay this morning, and then got to spend some time with Skulk Willem Joubert and the Stellenbosch team at Marble over lunch, trying out that wine. But as good as all of that was, there was an element of killing time until this evening and a run through some quite stunning South African Chardonnay, earth-shatteringly good stuff. And we are going to be climbing into that. And not just some great wine, but some great wine personalities, because our guests this evening represent 4 different areas of South African Chardonnay production, but the guests themselves are fantastic authorities with great wine histories and wine backgrounds themselves, and collectively make a fine, fine quartet for an analysis of the world of Chardonnay here in South Africa. So it gives me a huge amount of pleasure to welcome on Dan Really Likes Wine on International Chardonnay, which should really be a public holiday. I need to go back and have a look at the Constitution and send in a letter to the presidency. It might not be in practice, but we can make it in effect this evening, Chardonnay Day as a holiday. And our 4 guests represent 4 terrific estates, the estates of Wetshof, of Hamilton Russell, of Bartinney with us this evening, and also Paul Cluver, so covering Hemel-en-Aarde, covering Elgin, Stellenbosch and Robertson, with 4 great wine guests. Very good evening, gentlemen. A warm welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine.
Evening, Dan.
Well, let me let you know who you are looking at there. If you're watching, I think those are 4 rather good-looking gentlemen. Can they really be winemakers? Well, you've got Andries Berger. So while Paul Cluver takes all the credit, Andries does all the work. That's how things work at the Paul Cluver estate. Brian Cluver, who's a significantly more famous and successful member of the Clover family, who doubles up as head of marketing and Rose Jordan's bodyguard down at Bartinney. We've also got Anthony Hamilton Russell, as always, cutting a very elegant figure. I think he's in Londolozi or some other 17-star game lodge, celebrating his Jackie O body double wife's 28th birthday. And we've also got Johan de Vet, who is the man I'd like to kick off a very special evening with, because, Johan, if we look at the story of Chardonnay in South Africa, it's made for a movie, really. It's a crying shame this hasn't been on film yet, but effectively, and we can be honest here, Johan, we're amongst friends, you are part of what is really a family of international criminals.
Well, just trying to keep up with modern times, I guess.
Tell us a little bit. I think most people know roughly the Chardonnay story in South Africa, but it is so different and so exciting. Give us that snapshot. There was no Chardonnay, then suddenly there was Chardonnay in the dead of night, all very cloak and dagger. How did that process play out?
So it came into part when my dad was studying in Europe or in Germany, and he was tasting these international wines and just fell in love with the varietal Chardonnay. And came back home, looked at the soil we have, the sites we have, climate we have, and said, you know what, this is something that works internationally. It's a great product internationally. It should do well in South Africa. And if we want to compete on the international market, we need varietals that can actually stand its ground and compete on the international arena. So him and a couple of friends, Jan Boland Kutsie at the time was working at Joseph Drouin, and he phoned Jan and said, Jan, we need to get Chardonnay here. Can you organize some cuttings? So Jan said, no problem, he'll organize some cuttings. And a journalist called Fritz Joubert, his son is Emile Joubert, and so Fritz went over to visit, brought back a box of chocolates. And so brought it to his wife, who was working at KWV at the time, Maureen. And so Maureen phoned my dad and said, oh, Donnie, your box of chocolates has arrived. Can you come and collect your chocolates? So, yeah, I guess the rest is history. My dad collected the box of chocolates, planted this varietal Chardonnay, obviously propagated it. It went out into the industry as well. And today, Chardonnay is just, I think, a standard or a superstar of South African winery now.
It is indeed. And we're going to be tasting a couple of yours in just a moment. In fact, I had a bottle of the Mont Blanc with Michael Fridge on yesterday. It didn't last very long at all over lunch. You weren't the only person in those early days coming to grips with Chardonnay. Anthony, there was also a bit of skullduggery around your acquisition or your father's acquisition of Chardonnay for Hamilton, Russell.
There was. I call it creative sourcing. I really love the story. I haven't heard it before that Johannes told us, but I think my father, through the Swiss office of J. Walter Thompson, and he ran and owned South Africa's office of J. Walter Thompson, arranged for some Chardonnay cuttings to come in via airmail, basically. And we also propagated them in our nursery and planted them. But we only came to market, we only bottled our first Chardonnay 2 years after the Wetshof's first Chardonnay. But we were also one of those people trying to accelerate its availability to South African producers.
And you have a brand new release of that Chardonnay, which you're going to be trying in just a moment. As we're going to be trying a full range of wines from our friends at Paul Cluver. And Andries is here. Andries, when did Chardonnay rear its head for Paul Cluver?
Well, we started planting the Chardonnay in 1987. But we only started making wine on the property in 1997. So 1997 is the first. There was Chardonnays from Elgin, and the first Chardonnay from Elgin was actually 1990, which was Neil Ellis. The first wine from our side released was a Riesling. Neil Ellis made a Chardonnay from 1990, but Paul Cluver wines, as we are today, started in 1997.
All right, so we've got a little bit of history from all three. Let's complete that history lesson with Stellenbosch. I'm guessing, Brian, that probably Chardonnay goes back a little bit further there, given that there were some key protagonists who also had some Stellenbosch interests, part of that acquisition of Chardonnay operation.
Yeah, so, you've got the play around Siemensig, I think bottling the first Chardonnay in South Africa. Johan was just telling us earlier about it. But for us on this farm, we're like really high up in the mountains. These vineyards only got developed a little bit later on. But our first planting of Chardonnay at Bartinney was back in 1990. And that vineyard is still producing our top Chardonnay today. So they have the legs. They're producing incredible wines, even from a young age. But just as those vines develop and find like the happy space and mature a little bit, they really, 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 really offer you something special. And it's not just us, you can go, our next door neighbors, Capensis have got nice 30-year-old vineyards, Waterford as well. So there's quite a lot of us who got these old vineyards that we've taken care of over the years that are producing incredible wines.
Now, there's a reason I touch by way of commencement of the show on history, because right at the end, I'm going to be opening by some distance the oldest bottle of Chardonnay I've ever held, let alone drunk, and going to be trying that. And just the color is looking sensational. But we'll get to all of that a little later. And Poem Kwanazi watching, I agree on the public bank holiday for National Chardonnay Day. It's an absolute must. I'm voting for whoever has that on their political manifest. Andrew Patterson have a bottle of Ave Marie from Restless River in the cellar. You have a very, very nice bottle of wine there, Andrew Patterson. Let's look at our four regions in general before we go into the wine themselves. Let's head back to Robertson. And Mr. De Wet, we know about the famous limestone. It's reflected in your Limestone Hill Chardonnay. It speaks to a lot of the terroir from which our Robertson Chardonnay comes. What is it, though, for people who are still learning about understanding Chardonnay that makes that limestone, makes your terroir as a whole just so right for Chardonnay?
If you look at a lot of areas or Chardonnay producing areas in the world, a lot of them are based on limestone, or famous areas based on limestone soils, and of which Robertson sits on a high amount. I mean, we sit with pHs of around 8 in our soil, and depending on where you are, but some higher, some lower. And so it's really a soil type that just lends itself to Chardonnay, and Chardonnay just complements Chardonnay, and Chardonnay just excels on it. And it's easy to just look at the area. If you look at Robertson, 27% of all Chardonnay is planted in South Africa. So it's by far the biggest Chardonnay producing area in the country. And I think that explains a lot, about the area and about the varietal really being at home in our area. If you look at it from a wine point of view, always, you get that lovely chalky, salty, creamy, characters coming through, and always a spectrum of citrus. Robertson Chardonnay, always citrus characters.
Well, we'll examine that in slightly more detail, forensic detail, in just a second. Swing over to the Hemel-en-Aarde Valley, and Anthony, terroir very important as well, but you've also got that fabulous breeze that sweeps up over Hermanus and works its way into where you find yourselves. How does that combination work? Why does that combination lend itself to the Chardonnay in particular?
Well, firstly, I think rather than us deciding that Chardonnay was the thing for our area decided that Chardonnay was the best white wine expression of our sites and soils. And it's, I think we're 1,500 meters from the cool South Atlantic. And a lot of our Hemel-en-Aarde area is very unusually close to that cooling influence of the sea. So unlike, say, Burgundy, we're actually very maritime, which means our average maximum temperatures for our 4 hottest months, December, January, February, March, average out at 25 degrees centigrade. Burgundy, for that same period in the Northern Hemisphere, if you take their average maximum temperatures, is 24.8. So, and they get a much warmer middle 2 months with a cooler spring and a cooler autumn. So it's actually temperature-wise perfect. And then like Johan has limestone, like Burgundy in places, we have the clay, but without the limestone. So our clay content is actually almost exactly analogous to the Côte de Nuit, and actually even a little bit higher than the Côte de Beaune, where, to my mind, some of the greatest Chardonnays are made in the world. And the combination of moderation from proximity to a cold body of water, the presence of those extremely clay-rich soils, 400 million year old, shale with heavy clay soil on top, gives us the opportunity to produce quite austere, hard, minerally styles of Chardonnay. And as for Robertson, it's more on the citrus stroke pear end of the spectrum, not stone fruit and not tropical, and often confused with fine Burgundy. Not that we want to bask in their shadows, we're proudly African and South African, but we're often confused with white Burgundy.
And I think you lead into one of the really cool points about this discussion, which is we've got such different types of Chardonnay across South Africa, and there is so much to explore as a Chardonnay lover in South Africa. In terms of actually making the wine, Andries, for you as a winemaker, what is the big pull, the big allure of Chardonnay, and what are the big challenges in terms of getting it just right?
Well, I think firstly, the Chardonnay is one of those varieties that really shows typicity of where it's grown. And there's no other variety that actually can express itself as much as it does like Chardonnay. And I think that's the challenge, is to highlight the typicity of where it's grown. And like Anthony said, we also have very, very high clay-rich soils with high mineral or iron content in the soil. So you've got to harness that. You've got to try and express that. So for me, Chardonnay on the winemaking side is actually we're quite minimalistic. It's whole by pressing, it's settling without any additives, and it's a spontaneous natural fermentation as much as possible. To try and express where the grapes are grown. And I think what we have is, being also on the inland plateau, we have quite big diurnal differences. So we have cold nights. And the other thing that we have in Elgin is very high malic acid content, to the extent that we actually don't want malolactic fermentation, because we want to retain the freshness of the variety of acidity we get in the wines.
Well, there's your introduction to how to make Chardonnay. It's quite easy, really. Now you know exactly what to do if you want to make some of your own Chardonnay. And the making it is, of course, a challenge, but so too is the selling of wine and getting it out there. Brian, as much as the wine making is an area of specialty, so the marketing and the sales of wine is an area you spend a lot of time on. As a South African market, just looking first domestically, but then internationally, where do we sit in terms of South Africans appreciating, liking, wanting to buy our own Chardonnay? Have we got rid of that anything but Chardonnay club? And then what kind of impact is our Chardonnay having internationally?
Yeah, I definitely think we have passed our dark days, and Andries and his peers would probably be the first ones to admit to this. We went through a phase with Chardonnay that we got overexcited with oak. We got overexcited with other elements. And more in the last 10 to 5 years, we've moved away from that oaky, heavy wine into really making wines that are beautiful, fresh, and bright, and express where they're coming from. So moving away from these chunky things to where the oak is more like a frame of a beautiful painting. It's there to accentuate rather than dominate. And ever since we've come out of that, you're just seeing this growth in appreciation of Chardonnay. You know, you still go to wine shows and people say, oh, no, I don't like Chardonnay. And then you just say, well, listen, let's give this a go, see what you think. And they're like, oh, but it's different. It's not heavy. It's not dense. So we've done a huge amount in the winemaking side over the last few years. And you're really starting to see it come through in the market with people appreciate the brightness and lightness. Just touching onto the international side, I think South Africa is in a great window right now for Chardonnay. There's a shortage of top Chardonnay coming from Europe at the moment with a lot of challenges they're having. But on top of that, the demand is just huge for top Chardonnay from all over the world. And because of that sort of lack of availability specifically from Burgundy, South Africa is the perfect wine to fill that gap. We're making outstanding Chardonnays that have these classic elements to it and freshness. And I'm seeing huge growth in our numbers there. And I'm sure Anthony and Andres and Johan would agree. It's a really, really, really cool spectrum to be in. But with Chardonnay, you've got to love it. It's a hard fight. There's a lot of convincing still out there that needs to be done. But it's amazing how many people get into it and fall massively in love with the variety.
I think it is a great where there isn't a huge middle ground. There are those who don't like and those who do, but it is moving closer together. And those who do is a group that is growing, especially those who do like South African Chardonnay. Paul Kwanazi asking, I think, almost a rhetorical question there. Chardonnay still has that cloud. People continue to compare it to Sauvignon Blanc. I think it's trying to get people to advance from Sauvignon Blanc. Not forget about it. We make some great Sauvignon Blanc as well, but to experience some of the wonders and joys of Chardonnay as well. And Lloyd Lutz just throwing back there to the comment from Anthony. That's hitting the nail on the head. The terroir in Hemel-en-Aarde has made for superb Chardonnay. Well, in just a moment, we're going to try some of that Hemel-en-Aarde Chardonnay, but let us start with the Robertson and an exercise in vintage comparison, because amongst the dozens and dozens and dozens of bottles of wine you very kindly sent me up, Johan, were a couple of the Bon Vallon. And in fact, this very bottle, as I mentioned earlier, I had another one of them yesterday over lunch with Michael Frijon, the 2008 Bon Vallon Chardonnay. We're going to be comparing it with the 2020. So I've got both of them here, and I'm fascinated to see what the differences are and whether those are simply age or an element of style as well. Now, let's start with that 2008 and go back to it if we can, Johan. I think you were in standard 4 at the time, if memory serves. I've got a glass of it here. I think my opening gambit would be based on having it yesterday, trying some again this evening, that this is a marvelous illustration of a South African wine that's a touch over a decade old and is sitting in such a wonderful, wonderful space. Those slightly honeyed tertiary notes have opened up and given it that lovely little hint of sweetness on the back of everything else that you already mentioned as a hallmark. And it's become a wine that 13 years on really is doing you proud.
Yeah, thank you. I think the nice part of this wine is it's an unoaked Chardonnay, and a lot of people will say, oh, unoaked Chardonnay can't age. You know, you need an oak Chardonnay to age. And again, coming back to the soils that we have, the limestone in the soils, you know, we're sitting with low pHs, you know, really nice acids in our wines. So these wines are, even though they're unoaked, even though they're accessible, they're really designed to age as well, and definitely gain complexity, gain structure, and a bit of creamy, as you said, you know, a bit tertiary bottle aging characters definitely complements the unoaked Chardonnays. And so that's something that I'm happy to share tonight.
In terms of an unoaked Chardonnay, we go back to bad old days when it was chewing through a piece of wood. It's very rarely the case of at all anymore. But the decision to go, actually, we're going to go no oak at all. We're just going to let the fruit tell the story. Why make that decision? And why is this wine, if there's no oak, which we kind of think, oh, we must have oak if we're going to age a wine, why is this aging so well if it doesn't have any oak?
So my dad started unoaked Chardonnay, or the first one we did was in, I think, 1991, around there, 92. And it actually didn't work in the market. We launched it, didn't work in South Africa, took it off the market again and launched it a couple of years later, and it just was a booming success. So, to touch on what Brian said earlier, yes, today we are definitely using less oak, more elegant wines, more they are focused maybe. But if you look at going back in history, people wanted big, heavy, oaky Chardonnay. That was the style that people associated with Chardonnay. And yes, site definitely plays an important role. That's the fingerprint of who you are. But the market also dictates style to a certain extent. And I think this unoaked Chardonnay is definitely showing that. We brought it out, it didn't work, brought it out again. Today, unoaked Chardonnay outsells my oak Chardonnays. So just shows you how times change as well, and how fashion changes, and how that affects the way we produce wine as well.
Indeed, it could be in 30 years' time. My daughter is hosting the wine show and talking to your daughter making your wine, and they're shaking their heads and think, I can't believe they never had oak in their wine, as they drink something heavily wooded. Times change, and that's part of the beauty of wine. Wine itself also changes with time, even if it is the same wine. And again, it's an element so much of us love about it. We've got the 2020, which we're drinking in tandem with the 2008. We're going to taste a lot of different. Certainly, this one's going to be younger, it's going to be fresher. But from your perspective, from the man whose family gives us this wonderful wine, give us the key differences and whether this one is going to become what the 2008 is now in 12 years' time.
Certainly, for me, it's all about the fingerprint, and I think both these wines have the same fingerprint and or personality. You get that lemon peel, bit of grapefruit, citrus characters with a chalky minerality, bit of creaminess, really, a bit of saltiness at the back. And I think that I pick up right through both bottles. So it comes from the same site, the same area, the same vineyards. So nothing has really changed except the time in the bottle. And even though we have vintage differences, the fingerprint of that site will never change. And that's something to me always, when I taste parallel wines, is there a recognizable golden thread, or do I recognize the fingerprint? And definitely that is something that's very strong in both these wines.
We have one more of your wines to try right at the end of the show, and I've got goosebumps on my goosebumps anticipating that particular one. In fact, it's sitting beside me at the moment, just opening up a touch more. But remind us, before we head back to the Hemel-en-Aarde Valley via Londolozi, the number of Chardonnays you have and why for you have this number, why you feel it's so important to represent so many different areas, so much different terroir, so many different aspects of the estate.
We've got 6 different Chardonnays in our range, and each one comes from, it's all site specific. So each one comes from either area on the property or from a single vineyard. And as I said earlier, it's really, for me, it's showcasing that fingerprint of that site. And to me, that's what it's all about. And as Andre said earlier, Chardonnay really shows where it's coming from. What is it standing on? And that's the personality of the wine. And each one of these vineyards has its own unique personality, or the area has a unique personality. And that's what we do. We really look at, does this vineyard have a unique personality, and does it have the ability to age? Then it has a right to be a single vineyard. Other vineyards, they don't have that, but they sit in a group of vineyards that has that certain fingerprint of that area, and that's what we try to do.
I love that there can be areas yards away sometimes, it's sitting next door to each other, and yet somehow create something totally different. And a great example in the Wetshof of being able to, from the same estate, produce such different wine from the same grape. We're going to be back to the Wetshof right at the end of the show. Let's now go to Londolozi, where actually Anthony Hamilton-Russell has been threatening to get into the bath for his tasting. So avert your eyes just in case, or not. Just watch very closely. It might be the highlight of this year's show. Anthony, your brand new release. I was trying to do the numbers earlier. Is this year number 40 already?
It's actually the 39th vintage. Vintage 40s in the barrel as we speak.
Almost 4 decades in. It's been a wonderful journey. We've got this 39th vintage, the brand new 2020. I saw a number of people online today raving about it when I mentioned this was going to be one of them. So already it has been tasted far and wide. When you've got, as is the case with Hamilton-Russell, the two wines that you really focus on, you've decided Pinot Noir and Chardonnay are what we do and what we do well, and that is where we are going to give our focus. It doesn't give you too much room to maneuver because you've got one white wine and you've got to get that white wine right. How much pressure does that then put on you as a team to ensure that you're delivering both on the history of the wine in terms of what people have come to know and to expect, but also to ensure that you're getting the very, very best out of each and every vintage?
Well, you're absolutely right there, and that's one of the reasons we have a single wine. It's firstly philosophical. It's not so much us trying to make the greatest Chardonnay we can. It's on our 52-hectare piece of clay-rich ground on a 170-hectare property that we call our monopole. We express that through a single white and a single red. And our long experience, having tried several other varieties, showed us that Pinot Noir and Chardonnay had the most beautiful thing to say about that site. And we could, of our many barrels of Chardonnay and Pinot, we could go and apply our palates and select a reserve or something a bit more exciting, but then our own aesthetic judgment is imposing itself on what we do. It's no longer an honest expression of our monopole. And bearing in mind, we make a lot less Chardonnay. I've in awe of how successful the Wetshof is with Chardonnay. And I think to make a single wine in that quantity would be fairly challenging. And, as someone who's collected their Bateleur Chardonnay, amongst others, they have the possibility of having several different Chardonnays. I like the discipline of one Chardonnay. And to borrow an analogy from the winemaker at Krug, a single vineyard to some extent is a soloist, even though obviously across a vineyard things change a bit. But that's listening to a great soloist. If you blend a few vineyards, that's kind of like a string quartet. But when in our case, they're not always all in production, but 20 different parcels of Chardonnay on our 52-hectare monopole, that becomes more like an orchestra. And we really see the benefit of blending those together. And you're right, we cannot afford to make a mistake. We'll unhesitatingly reject a faulty wine, but we will not reject a wine if we simply don't think it suits our individual palate for that particular vintage, because that's then us imposing our aesthetic judgment on a true expression of site and soil.
We cannot afford to make a mistake. Thunderous words from Mr. Hamilton-Russell. Let's see if he made any mistakes with the 2020. I've tasted this already. I got a glimpse of it earlier this week with Anthony and Oliver ahead of her birthday celebrations. The 2020 Hamilton-Russell Chardonnay, only just hitting the market. Give us the lowdown on the latest iteration of your iconic Chardonnay, Anthony.
Well, I like the 2020. It's, and Johan uses the term fingerprint. I use the term sort of almost like genetics and family resemblance. And the idea is the terroir is the genetics, the underlying family resemblance between the different vintages. And then we're very, very careful to express the individual personality of a particular vintage and not to work against it. 2020, very low sugar to alcohol conversion rates for the yeasts. I think that was an industry-wide thing. And phenolic ripeness at lower than usual alcohol. So a typical Chardonnay for us would be about 13.2 alcohol. This is 12.9. So there's not a massive difference, but it is got a lightness of step. And then that typical Hamilton Russell kind of, limes, citrus, pear fruit, and that mild hint of reduction that to me is what minerality would smell like if it had a smell. I think minerality is not a taste or a smell, it's a sensation of hardness. And that's another characteristic of the wine. So very typically Hamilton Russell. And once again, and I don't want to keep referring to Burgundy, but we were sitting with an MW student who guessed 11 of the 12 wines put in front of her at diploma exams. And she said that's just dead ringer to her for Pouligny-Montrachet. So, we're not copying it. It's a stroke of geological good fortune that near the southern tip of Africa, on our particular site, that is the true expression of that site and those soils.
Lloyd Lutz digitally licking his lips. Imagine a vertical tasting of 4 decades, says Lloyd, happily daydreaming about that particular prospect. Maybe we might just be able to make it happen one day with the Hamilton Russell team. And then a question for you from Fabien Letiec. How long do you age your Chardonnay to have the best expression of it?
Again, I don't like to pass judgment on that. I typically have been someone that has liked young, vibrant, fresh white wine, and our Pinot Noir between 10 and 20 years old. And I'm only recently really discovering the pleasures of drinking our Chardonnay with significant bottle age. So I opened an 88 and an 89 not long ago, and the color, for someone who's not initiated, might cause them to look for fault. But the wine itself was absolutely beautiful. And I think you're going to find the same with the 81 de Wetshof. And so I can't tell you, it's up to your personal preference. But basically, I think our wine has a beauty when we release it. The 2020 is already 50% sold, sadly. And the wines do sell uncomfortably fast, but we keep a small vertical back for sale with art labels at the back. And that's the 15, 16, and 17. And we'll release 18, 19, and 20 as soon as the 20 sells out. So there is always older Chardonnay available. And we have many collectors that only think of drinking it with about 10 years of bottle age. So I really can't answer the question. It depends on what you like. If you want rich, nutty, deep, a little more profound and complex, give it, 10 years or so in the bottle. If you like nervous, edgy, minerally, and steely, drink it young.
Lisa Harlow watching from the UK. It's amazing how consistent the Hamilton Russell Chardonnay is over the years and those lime flavors. Well, Lisa, add the 2020 to that long line of consistent deliveries. Grant Sauls is watching over on YouTube. What a great panel for Chardonnay Day. I've opened a Cristal and clay shells to celebrate, but I definitely enjoy all of the brands you have on the panel this evening. Proudly South African wines. And then as we head over to Andries down at Paul Cluver, question from Poem Kwanazi. What time do you pick the grapes and does that make a difference? Interesting, slightly technical question. Does picking them before dawn or waking up at lunchtime after a big night the night before and only getting round to it in the early afternoon make a difference, Andries?
Yes, then definitely makes a difference. We tend to start picking at 5 o'clock in the morning and normally stop by lunchtime, but we're quite fortunate that we've got big Apple cold storage room facilities right next to the farm, so we can actually make use of the cold stores at Kroco. So what we do is we take the grapes into cold storage and then work from cold storage as we progress through during the day.
All right, so that is how it works. For the 2 weeks of the year that they do any work, they have to get up at 4 in the morning and can pick those early grapes. We've got 3 Chardonnays from you, Andries. 2 of the 3, I think, have just won awards, both the Village and the 7 Flags. And you tell us about those in a moment. A little earlier, we did the 2008 versus the 2020 of the same wine. Here we're looking at how you move through the different labels that you have at Paul Cluver, the village where you kick off up to the estate, and then the 7 flags. Broadly speaking, before we try them, what defines them? How do you decide, well, these grapes are village, these grapes are 7 flags, and something in between, well, that'll be estate?
Well, I distinctly remember Paul and myself going to Burgundy, tasting wine with Martin Preer, and tasting wine from barrel, and he immediately tasted the wine and he discarded and said, no, he took from the wrong barrel, we should take another barrel. And we asked him, and he said, but it's a beautiful Chardonnay. And he said, no, it's from young vineyards. We should taste the barrels from the old vineyards. And we said, but it's a beautiful Chardonnay. He said, well, that's the problem. Young vineyards tend to show characters, whereas old vineyards tend to show typicity of the soil. You know, young vineyards needs to be reined in a little bit to gain more age and get more natural balance. And that made us also thought, and we went on a quite extensive planting program of Chardonnay, planting new vineyards. So we have to find a way to find a home for the young vineyards. So that's where the village comes in, and the idea is fresh, you know, citrus-driven style of Chardonnay. It's partly fermented in old barrels, but then a big percentage is fermented in large format oak, 2,500 liter oak, and then a bit of stale. So the idea is much more varietal expression that's the vineyards, and as we move to the older vineyards, the estate Chardonnay is from vineyards that's at least 12 to 15 years old. We actually get more typicity of our estate. It's from our older vineyards where the natural yield is lower, the concentration is much more, and it's just one that gives much more. And then obviously we move on to 7 Flags, which is a vineyard that was planted in 1987. And if you think in 1985, South Africa only had 300 hectares of Chardonnay. I think it doubled by 1990 to about 600 hectares. But that vineyard, it just produces the most amazing concentrated fruit, and it is really it's the oldest vineyard in Elgin actually, and it just produces the most amazing grapes, and one from that every year. So 7 Flags is from a single vineyard, and then the barrel selection.
Well, there you go. It is age above all that is dictating what goes where. Let's go into the first of those, the village. And you could, if you were going on very technical terms or something, well, this is the entry level, except it's anything but an entry level wine once you drink it, because this is just won an award, I think. Tell us what that award was, and then talk us through the first of your 3 Chardonnays.
Well, yeah, we're quite lucky because South Africa won 13 golds at the International Wine Challenge, and we won 4, and 2 of the 4 was actually for Chardonnay. The village Chardonnay got a gold, and also the 7 Flags got the gold, and also the South African trophy for Chardonnay. So we got quite that. But the village, like I said, you know, there's for me the focus on freshness. It's focused on varietal, lots of citrus characters. We don't want oak wine, so that's where there's no oak involved. It's only older barrels in the Foudre. And it needs to be, you know, in my mind, a lively, fresh style of Chardonnay, and I think we've hit the nail there.
It's zesty and is full of life and still young. And this is one of those Chardonnays, if you are early on in your introduction to Chardonnay and you're still not too sure about it, I feel more comfortable with Sauvignon Blanc. Well, this has got that youth and that zest and that energy and electricity, and also at a really, really good price to just get you going to start exploring. But be warned, once you do start exploring Chardonnay, you're very unlikely to go back. From this, your next step up as you make your way into the world of Paul Cluver would be the estate Chardonnay. What's the big difference between Chardonnay 1 and Chardonnay 2?
So on the Foudres, we actually do inoculate. We use yeast on the barrels to inoculate, and the estate Chardonnay is 100% non-inoculate ferment, spontaneous ferment. We do 100% whole batches, no settling additives. So it's very natural and fermentation in barrel. So it's basically it is the vineyard that actually, does the wine, because we do minimal interference. We don't do too much butternut. We don't want malolactic fermentation in the wine, because we want to retain the tension. We retain that the minerality, the acidity in the wine. But there's much more layers to this wine. There's more complexity. There's more depth. Every time you sniff the wine, you discover another nuance, and that's where the complexity comes in from. The more age of the vineyard, better concentration from what we get.
Johan spoke about having the fingerprints to the wines. Anthony spoke about the DNA or the family resemblance. Is there meant to be a golden thread, or maybe I think gold's the right color, a golden thread that runs through the three and connects them in terms of all being part of the Paul Cluver whole?
Absolutely. I think tension, acidity, the citrus drive to it, that's sort of a thread that goes through all of them, in just different concentrations and different nuances. I think definitely. I think the other thing that I really look for is elegance. We don't want an over flashy, showy style of Chardonnay. We want the wine to be elegant. And one thing that I've learned very early in my winemaking career is actually, I was working in Bordeaux at Chateau Margaux, and I asked the late Paul Cluver, in his mind, what is the three most important things in wine? And his answer was balance and balance and balance. And in all the wines I make, and especially with Chardonnay, you have to have the perfect balance. The balance between the fruit, the acidity, the balance between the concentration and the oak. Because if you don't have balance, you're going to have an incomplete wine. And for me, balance is a really important part in what I look for in wine.
I am a very, very big fan of balance. In fact, I'm also a big fan of it as the way you approach and drink wine, and that you should never have an odd number of glasses, which is why we are trying 8 wines through the course of this evening. Give us a final comparison, if you will, Andries, of the estate, and then taking it in to the Seven Flags, your flagship, but also to preempt that, answer a question from Mpom Kwanazi: is the Paul Cluver vegan friendly?
Yes, so on vegan friendly, all my wines are vegan friendly. We don't use any animal products in any of our wines. So yes, our wines are definitely vegan friendly. And then going on to Seven Flags, like I said earlier, this vineyard was planted in 1987. It's on the most perfect site on the farm, and it just year on year keeps producing the most amazing grapes. We get about, if we've got to get technical, we normally get about 6 or 7 tons per hectare still from this site, and it's a very slow ripening site, south facing, and we just get so much great concentration in the grapes. And then from a winemaking side, it's like exactly the same as what we do with this. There's no difference in the approach. The difference is absolutely the vineyard and the typicity that we get from that vineyard. It's always very elegant. It's always citrus driven. There's in Seven Flags definitely much more of a minerality tone to the wine. A little bit like Anthony also mentions, truck match. I agree with him. That's much more of a sensation than aroma or something you can taste. It's part of the whole experience of tasting the wine, and we definitely have much more of that. But the most important thing for me with Seven Flags, it's never going to be the most obvious wine. It's not the one that's going to jump out of the glass. But every time you're going to discover something more that's much more complex and it's much more lingering and long in the aftertaste.
Well, this is 2018. This is just getting started. Put the rest of the case away, lock it up in a time capsule, and come back in 10, 15 years' time and discover some properly majestic Chardonnay. And I love the way you see that journey culminate in this, which is quite fabulous. You can see why it won the Chardonnay trophy, and congratulations again. Let's head down to Stellenbosch to complete our journey before one last look at Robertson and to Mr. Clover. The Stellenbosch Chardonnay, does occasionally sit in the shadow of the big reds, the Bordeaux styles or Stellenbosch styles that get so much attention, which is a little unfair on Chardonnay, Brian, because you guys also won a big award very recently with the Hourglass, and across the board, Stellenbosch with nuance and change in style depending where in broader Stellenbosch you are, just consistently delivering on the grape, and I think having a lot of fun with this as well.
Yeah, it's it's a bit of a blessing of Stellenbosch, but a curse in its own. It's one of these incredible regions where most things actually work and grow here. So, and I'm not digging at anyone, but Cabernet generally doesn't do that well in Elgin, and I think Paul Cluver is a good example where they pulled out the Cab and the Cab Franc. Stellenbosch is just this region where Chenin does brilliantly, Sauvignon Blanc does well in the right areas, Chardonnay in the right spots does exceptionally well. So we've almost got the slight issue being quite a big region with these so many microclimates that exist. And we need to find better ways of communicating that and talking about why these little spots are super special. What Rustenburg's been doing with Chardonnay and Stellenbosch for years is incredible. Then you get families like the Molyneux making a Chardonnay from where they could have chosen anywhere, and they chose Stellenbosch. Capensis, what they're pulling off at the moment with their new farm, which is our neighbor. And then you get Uvemere has made some of the most insanely good wines for years. And then the farm that everyone forgets about, Vergelegen and Andre van Rensburg's Chardonnays are absolutely stunning as well. So we have this little problem in Stellenbosch where we actually need get a little bit better in our communication on what we do super well in the right places. But we're also learning as well that you need to plant the right varieties in the right spots. And if it's not working properly, then take it out. And I think Andries' story about his Seven Flags vineyard is amazing. It's giving 7 to 10 tons a hectare, and it's 30 years old. That is a financially viable vineyard that is making incredible wine. That's awesome. Just one note on that wine. There's something I always get in it. Is this beautiful notchy skin. Whenever I have that wine, I absolutely love that element out of that wine.
There we go. Brian Clover, one of the few people who eats the entire nachi, not just the flesh inside, because it reminds him of a Seven Flags Chardonnay. Let's go to your particular area if we can. You've done so well. You've got a masterful winemaker in Ronel who does the grapes full justice. What's working so well for you guys, and what's the style of Chardonnay you're able to deliver as a result?
So generally from where we are, it's the Bangkok region is much cooler than the heart of Stellenbosch. So we get a lot of morning sun on this property rather than afternoon sun. So we don't get a lot of solar radiation where our Chardonnay vineyards are planted. But in general, our Chardonnay, I find, is a little bit broader than what you'll get from the Hemel-en-Aarde Valley or from Elgin. It's a little bit richer, rounder. So when they were mentioning flavors and that sort of thing, we definitely get those, but we also get these spicy elements coming through as well, like a little bit of ginger, preserved ginger, and a touch more sort of some white fruits like apricots and that sort of thing. I also tend to go more towards lemon flavor characteristics over lime in Stellenbosch, so that nice lemon rind, and generally a little bit broader. But every Chardonnay has got its place. Like I'm drinking 2 of our Chardonnays here. I've got our normal Bartinney Chardonnay, which has got that matchstick lemon citrusy elements, and then the Hourglass, which is a little bit more broader, rounder, fuller, and more intense. So there's a time of day for each Chardonnay, really, from breakfast through to climbing to bed.
I love the fact, not a time all day, a time in the day for every single Chardonnay, and that Hourglass is a fabulous example thereof. Just a final word from you, from a marketing perspective, Brian, because that is a particular passion of yours. You talk about needing to understand where we plant, what we do, how we get the wine right in the fields and in the vineyards into the bottles. What do we need to do more of as South Africa to get our Chardonnay firmly into not just the international market we always think rather romantically of, but also back here at home?
Just confidence. It's as simple as that. We just need to sing our hymns a little bit louder. We're doing everything right now. everything is, the foundation is laid by great viticulture, amazing winemaking. And now we just need to actually stand up and say, hey, we can actually stand up in this space. Anthony was mentioning what people are tasting doing the wine masters and thinking we're making some of the top burgundies. It's amazing that we've been doing this for a while now. It's just really standing up and just really getting onto our pedestal and just talking more about it. We can do it. We've done all the blind tastings for years. Let's just get out there and be kind and to the wines and give them what they deserve.
The reference to our past is an important one because it segues nicely into our very last wine of the evening as we bring it in. The Newstead Family Vineyards team saying, we chose Plettenberg Bay, and you're making some lovely wine therein. We're overdue having you on the show, so I shall be in touch. It'd be great to celebrate some of your bubbles. Let's go to the last one. I'm going to reach over here with great dexterity, so forgive me for a second as I disappear off screen. And you might be thinking, as I bring it over, that clearly... And there we go. Clearly Andres has sent me some Elgin apple juice, because that's what it looks like, doesn't it? It looks like some of that slightly sweet, ever so slightly sticky apple juice that you'll get at your local supermarket, and that you have just normal fruit juice, but in fact it is not, because this is the bottle from which this wine comes. Some 1981 de Wetshof Chardonnay. I'm holding history in my hand. I haven't tried it yet. I wanted to have the first taste live on the show. I'm about to do that. Just before I do pour that very first sip, give me a little bit of history, Johan, on this wine and what I'm going to be drinking.
Yeah, that's before I was born. So to give you the history on what exactly happened, that's up to my dad. But 1981 was the first commercial vintage we released. So the first vintage was 1980. We never put it on the market. We kept it back to the family. And then 81 was the vintage we put under our label and sent it, it was the first commercial vintage. So, but back then it was young vineyards we worked with, just planted, as in 1980, so small that we couldn't even sell it. So 81, the first time that we had something sellable from it. So, again, and here's a nice story around all this, Yes, with old vineyards, you get complexity. The vineyards even out, they adapt better to vintage differences. But, sometimes these young vines, even though they are more fruit driven, they give you something spectacular. And I just tasted this wine as well now, and it's holding up beautifully. There's no oxidation. You got bottle age, yes, but it's still, fruit, citrus, bright acidity, layers and depth. And that's something which I think it's, that's Chardonnay. It's young or old. Chardonnay is just a wonderful variety. And when kept well, they just become magic.
All right. Well, here we go then. To wrap up this evening's show, before I jump across to host tonight's Pick and Pay dinner with the team from Warwick and JD, that kicks off in a couple of minutes' time. Here is my very first sip of the 1981 de Wetshof Chardonnay. Johan, I'm honored and deeply grateful that you've sent this through to me. So here we go. He promises me it's going to be good. Let's see. Ooh. You are absolutely... I got to be honest, John. I thought you might be selling a little too hard there. And I thought there's got to be some oxidation. It's 40 years old. It's got to have that rough around the edges. It's not. It is smooth. It is rich. It's nowhere near overpowering or even abrasive. And this is 40 years old. It's ridiculous. But gee, this is fabulous. And you know what's great? I've got an entire carafe and I'm the only one in the house who likes Chardonnay. It is the perfect note on which to wrap up what has been a fascinating hour. So let's bring everybody back up on screen to wrap up the show, just so that I can say a big thank you to you all, because, gentlemen, it's been really special spending time with all of you. So to Brian, the team at Bartinney, Andries and Paul Cluver, a great selection there. The 24-year-old Olive Hamilton Russell, and security there. And another beautiful vintage from a beautiful estate. Johan, you've spoiled me today to drink a wine that is older than you. I'd love to say it's older than me. It's not quite, but it's pretty close to it. But collectively, what you guys have done with us this evening is what you continue to do on a day-by-day basis, on a vintage-to-vintage basis, which is show us as South Africans just what wonderful Chardonnay we can make, and to show the rest of the world that it's not just Burgundy that can deliver this particular grape quite so well. So to Bartinney, to Paul Cluver, to Hamilton Russell, and to Wetshof, and to 5 fabulous representatives thereof. Guys, thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your International Chardonnay Day. Thank you to everybody who's been watching and has been joining us. If you are part of our Pick and Pay Warwick dinner, join myself and JD and Jonathan in about 2 minutes online, which we're looking forward to. But to the 5 of you in particular, it's been a splendid evening, a very special evening, and thank you for an absolute treat. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you. Cheers.
Yes.
There we go. What a way to celebrate International Chardonnay on Dan Really Likes Wine. And Dan Really Likes Wine partnering up, as I say, with that Pick and Pay dinner, because we're great friends with Pick and Pay. And we urge you, if you haven't already, to be part of that Pick and Pay Wine Club. Earlier today, you would have got 20% off Chardonnay if you bought 3 bottles. But they're always great deals. And if you're a member of the Wine Club, it is discounts, it is smart shopper points, it is competitions, and it's the chance to be part of great food dinners, as you can be if you're joining us shortly. If you're not joining this one, you can join the Paul Cluver dinner, and that is happening on the 24th of June, and we would love to see you there. Andries will be part of that one as well. Thank you so much for being part of this evening's show. Join me again live next week, Monday evening, and look out for this week's show when I take Kleine Zalza for some Portuguese food. Have a great evening. Keep drinking Chardonnay, keep drinking South African wine, and keep remembering that, gee, we do a pretty good job. Goodbye.